Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome new faces. I won't do a full introduction because we all got name tags, more or less.
I appear to have changed mine today.
Well, that'll do. Today.
Parks.
Right, so I'm just going to get straight on with it. Apologies for absence. Who have we got? Oh, sorry.
Councillor Gillian Peake, Councillor Ron Durento and Councillor John Marshall.
Fabulous, that's great. The only announcement I've got, Chair's announcements, is the next meeting is going to be at the Fire Training Centre in Bury, which we're trying to double that up with a bit of training for the people that weren't here for the pre-meeting about the work programme. We haven't got an exact time on that. I'm guessing about 4:30, 5 o'clock when we get a full tour of the training facility, and then we'll commence our regular meeting at 6 o'clock. We're trying to kill two birds with one stone there for the people that weren't here earlier. And I don't know if it might be, I don't know if we can, but it might be other scrutiny members from the other groups that might want to go on that. In that, with the subs moving from committee to committee, people might be interested to know what you do. I would be interested, even if it wasn't my remit to scrutinise it. So I'll leave that with you, Susan. Declarations of interest. Have we got any for this meeting? Have we all filled our forms out? Have the new members filled the forms out? Totally quiet. I'll take that as a silent agreement. Minutes of the last meeting, 19th of June, seems like a lifetime ago. For the people that were here, would anyone like to propose those?
Sure. Can I just...
Yeah.
Sorry, just for a point of clarification, because obviously I'm a substitute member, very happy to be here, but I was under the impression that I was a substitute member in the events that Councillor Pickstone wasn't able to attend, but apparently that's not the case. So I just wanted some clarification on how the substitutes actually work, because I noticed there was only 10 members present at the previous meeting, and then there was a meeting that was cancelled as well. So I just wanted to check whether there was actually an issue with not enough members attending these meetings, which is why I was actually being asked to come as a substitute, not for a Liberal Democrat.
Susan.
A couple of things. We try and ensure that, wherever possible, meetings are quorate by using substitutes. What we do is we go out initially to groups to make sure that we have the right political balance at the meetings. But additionally, if we still look like we might not be quorate, we then throw it open to anybody who would like to attend on the substitutes list. So we always try and make sure that the political balance is observed. But if it's a risk of the meeting not being quorate, we will sort of use whatever substitutes we have. So it's a little bit of a sort of an art form, really, ensuring the committees are quorate. The second thing, the meeting wasn't cancelled because it wasn't quorate last time. It was cancelled because a substantive agenda item was pulled because of the fire services, other business on the moors, putting out fires, and so that was the main piece of So it was really the chair. In consultation with the chair, the meeting was cancelled. So yeah, but.
So it's a pull, to a degree, it's a pull. So if you would like to come to the fire service tour, I'm sure you'll be welcome. So going back to the minutes, would somebody like to propose the minutes?
I'll move them.
Thank you. Seconder? I'll do that, because I was here. Any matters arising from the previous minutes from June? No? So we'll move on straight to report. Rishi. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just propose to do a short introduction and take questions. I think in the first instance I would say it was absolutely the right thing to do this report in the aftermath of the arena attack. It's a subject matter which is sensitive and controversial, but I think one that we looked to address and to investigate. I'm sure we can all vividly remember the aftermath of the arena attack, but certainly from Bury we lost 2 young people in that attack, one of which lived in my ward and lived only 5 minutes away. And it brought home the reality of what can happen in terms of terrorism, but how what once was seen as something that was global, something that was overseas, perhaps in other parts of this country, is now very much a reality and part of the landscape of our lives in Greater Manchester. So I think it was the absolutely right thing to do, this piece of work. I'd also highlight that although I was the chair of the commission, this was an independent piece of work with independent commissioners. A heavyweight panel with people of experience in a whole range of different matters, whether it be legal, academic, practitioners in the area, and also people who had themselves been radicalised, people like Nigel Bromwich, people who had experience from the coalface of what social exclusion can do and where it can lead. I think it's also important to say at the outset, this report is the start of a journey, not the end of one. It doesn't seek to have all the answers, but it sets us on a path, I think, a direction of travel to look at things we can do to improve the quality of lives within Greater Manchester, not just in the context of extremism or radicalisation, but in a way to improve social cohesion, which I think is vitally important, and tackle the inequality that exists within our conurbation. Chair, the remit of the Commission, it's had 4 key objectives which were considered separately. Firstly, to identify the broader determinants of social exclusion and how people across Greater Manchester could work collectively to address them. To consider how a distinctive community-led Greater Manchester approach to challenging hateful extremism could be developed. To understand if a Greater Manchester Charter could be an effective way to promote social cohesion, and to evaluate how Prevent operates within Greater Manchester. And I'll just take a moment for me just to take you through some key findings and some key recommendations and then take questions. In terms of looking at the broader determinants of social exclusion and how we can work effectively to address them, based on the consultation process that we undertook, which engaged almost 2,000 people across Greater Manchester, there were 54 engagement events based on the academic research, based on the experience of our commissioners. It was quite clear that there isn't a single driver to how people become radicalised, and we've never suggested that there is. And by that I'm saying, we're not saying that social exclusion or inequality leads to radicalisation, but it can and does have a negative impact on social cohesion, people feeling included within an area, people accessing opportunities. And the report found that economic opportunity for all is a key pillar to better integration. And that to get better integration and to improve the lot of our residents isn't just the role of public services, but businesses and our communities. A common theme that came out of the consultation that we had was there was a feeling that there was disinvestment in certain areas. There wasn't enough investment in certain areas, such as youth services, for example. A common theme which came out in all the engagements we had across Greater Manchester is that there wasn't enough opportunity for younger people, which created this sense of groups being socially excluded. And then that informed some of the recommendations. So some of the recommendations that we put forward in relation to creating more socially inclusive Greater Manchester was to look at how we created opportunity. And again, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive list, but these are some of the recommendations we put forward. One was to build on the good work that's already been undertaken by Greater Manchester's Inclusive Growth Analysis Unit and accept the recommendations that they set out in their 2017 report. That we should look to develop an online portal for younger people aimed at opening access to employment opportunities and work placements, because that again was direct feedback we got during the consultation process. There was a big theme about there being a lack of community spaces for communities to engage in, to have conversations, to bring generations together. We recommended that there's an audit of all public space across the public services in Greater Manchester to see what could be available to support our communities. We talked in terms of promoting social mobility. We talked about recommending an extension to the Mayor's half-price 16 to 18 bus pass to make that free travel for younger people across Greater Manchester, so they could explore other parts of the conurbation, but also access educational and job opportunities. In terms of the second line of inquiry, we talked about how we could develop a distinctive community-led approach to challenging hateful extremism. And the key there is about engagement with our communities. This isn't something that can be done on a top-down basis. It was quite clear that there was a sense that people didn't feel listened to, that they felt that their voices couldn't be heard, and that created a sense of anger and people feeling disenfranchised. People felt, for want of being politically correct, they couldn't express themselves. There was a lack of a safe space. And those were comments that came across from members of different communities, that they felt because of the world in which we live, in the aftermath of the Arena attack, and before that, people felt they couldn't express their views clearly, which I think, and you'll see it from the report, part of the key tenet of having a socially cohesive community is the ability to express yourself without fear of ridicule or fear that the long arm of the law might grab you by the collar. If we want a fully democratic society where people can participate, they do need safe spaces in which to express themselves. Some of the recommendations that we made around this area was to create a new set of community engagement principles. And we use the term new set is because we do need to take into account, I feel, the very strong sense of feeling we got from Greater Manchester's communities in terms of our engagement, that people felt they didn't feel that they were listened to. We also felt it would be very helpful to focus on bringing different communities together, so having a much more formal sense of formal structure of mentoring within Greater Manchester. And within that, developing intergenerational opportunities. Because one of the things that we found was, we talk about there being a lack of, or there being elements of Greater Manchester that felt socially excluded. You know, when we talk about social isolation and things like loneliness, they're all key issues and key challenges that we face, but they're not exclusively felt by older people or younger people. In fact, the evidence suggests that when we talk about loneliness, actually, it crosses the generations. So bringing different generations together across Greater Manchester would be something that we could help develop as a public service. We talked about linking in with government policy around the creation of a cohesion and integration network. And we have put in a bid, and it's referred to in the covering report, to the Integrated Communities Investment Fund. And that we as Greater Manchester should look to host the first community and integration network. And we also looked about developing, in terms of developing this community-led approach, about making it more community-led from the perspective that if you have concerns about someone who is vulnerable, maybe someone with mental health issues or so on and so forth, you feel far more comfortable maybe seeking help or assistance on that person's behalf. When we're talking about the terrorism space or the radicalisation space, you're much more less willing to do so because it is inherently a criminal space. Determining whether or not somebody is being radicalised is incredibly complicated. So just even having some guidance outside of the criminal space, some way you can turn to for advice, would be incredibly helpful. As I'll come on to in a moment, I'm sure during the discussion when you ask your questions, we do need to take a much more safeguarding-oriented approach to how we tackle radicalisation. It is a multiplicity, it's a very, very complicated issue, but as local authorities and public services, we are best placed and have the experience to operate in that safeguarding space. So we talked about creating an informal phone line where people, if they had concerns, could ring up and get advice without the fear that they would be criminalising the person that they were speaking about. Just as evidence that actually we did listen to people, one of our key lines of inquiry was whether or not we should develop a Greater Manchester Charter to sort of publicise the messages of social cohesion. We talked about creating a Greater Manchester set of values. And the feedback we got was, that would be a terrible idea. To quote Hilary Pilkington, Professor Hilary Pilkington, when you try and capture a spirit, you kill it. We saw a remarkable sense of coming together after the arena attack, but that was organic. For us to try and replicate that, for that to be top down, for public services or command authority or local councils to try and prescribe what that looks like, it wouldn't work. And that's the feedback that we got from our consultation. So the key finding was that would not be an effective way to promote social cohesion. And finally, and then I'll answer questions, I apologise if I've gone on a bit too long, but finally, and perhaps more controversially, we considered how Prevent operates in Greater Manchester across all agencies. And what we found was, when it was explained to people what the broader principles around what Prevent is, people accepted what those principles are. People accepted the need to prevent people, vulnerable people, being radicalised, to prevent them from harm, from going down a path which potentially could lead to a terrorist act or being radical in some other way. But there was a huge lack of understanding about what Prevent is. There is a huge need for public services to share information about what it is, not just explaining what it is, but be transparent about it. Talk about facts and figures. Talk about how many ongoing cases there are. Talk about what outcomes have come from those, to put this into a context. And that is a message that came out loud and clear. That when you hear discussion and phrases such as Prevent being a toxic brand, a lot of that came from a space where actually it had not been fully articulated what Prevent was and what it was supposed to do. And I think that is a huge role for us to play moving forward, about articulating what Prevent is and how it works. Because unless we do, we cannot have a truly community-led approach to tackling hateful extremism and building social cohesion. We also found that there was a distinct lack of support for people who didn't meet various thresholds. So unless you met a threshold and you didn't fit into a neat little box, you might not get a referral to another service. So for example, you may have issues surrounding your mental health. So it wasn't that wraparound support, there wasn't a holistic approach at looking how you supported people. Again, there was a lot of feedback in relation to the need before you engage in that criminal space for informal support and guidance. Again, linked to people understanding what Prevent is and what they could and what could be done around that. The Commission endorsed the rollout of Operation Dovetail, or a second pilot of Operation Dovetail, which seeks to shift the safeguarding responsibility under Prevent from police to the local authority, which I think is a very, very sound move. Local authorities, I think, are skilled. Remember, Prevent, Channel, they are voluntary programmes. We're not in a situation where somebody is in the criminal space, so it makes sense if there are safeguarding concerns and using the language of safeguarding for local authorities to take the lead. We've recommended that a communications toolkit is developed in relation to Prevent to articulate the things I've spoken about what it actually is and what it means, what is the context behind it. We've talked about more training and refresh training for public sector staff who engage in this space. And it also references the North West Regional Pilot, which is a regional multi-agency centre which is talking about sharing of information between intelligence agencies and the public services for those people who did meet a criminal threshold at one point but perhaps have fallen below that, so to ensure that no one falls within the net without getting the adequate support. So I'll wrap up there, Chair, but just to say, this report, it doesn't seek to provide a panacea to all our problems, but I think it does set a direction. Come September, there'll be a report coming to the Combined Authority looking at the governance, looking at how we can deliver some of this, And I repeat, it's not just solely the role of the combined authority or the local authorities across Greater Manchester or other public services. It's a whole community-based approach that we need to take. But I think it does give us firm recommendations and at least a sense of where we need to be, I think, to tackle hateful extremism and also to promote social cohesion.
Thank you for that. Rishi, just before I open up for questions, just going back to Prevent, did your team arrive at Prevent was a positive? Admittedly, you've explained it's not been communicated out very well, but did you arrive at the conclusion that it was a positive thing? Because I've heard a lot of negative things about Prevent. Did your team feel it was worth continuing and you liked it, basically?
What's the definition of a loaded question? The role of this commission wasn't to like or dislike Prevent. The role of the commission was to look at its operation. And at the end of the day, it's not for us to put words into people's mouths. What we had, I'm not saying that's what you're doing, by the way, but what we had in terms of the outcomes of the consultation is that people accepted the principles of Prevent. Who wouldn't think it's a worthwhile thing to do to have a policy which looks, and a system, a process which looks to prevent people being radicalised and engaging in potentially terrorist acts? That's what Prevent is meant to do. It's meant to prevent people, keep them safe from harm. No one disagreed with those principles. What we did find, however, is that because of a lack of information about it, and you'll see it in the report, there was a perception that it targeted some specific communities, the Muslim community, for example. We need to work very, very hard to articulate what it's for, how the community can have a role in it. And then that brings into my points around having intermediate steps like an informal advice line, etc. So you're not automatically going into the counter-terrorist space. If you have concerns about someone, say someone who's vulnerable or what have you in your community, you're not instantly going to make the link, I would think, that there's an issue of radicalisation here. It might mean that that person needs support, but having those eyes and ears in the community might mean they get that support, which can prevent any progression into sort of radicalisation. So we're talking about that whole sort of safeguarding approach. I would refer you, actually, just on the point about scope and scale of Prevent. I don't know if you've got the full report in your pack, but if you page 79 of the full report, paragraph 7.14, it talks about the scale. It talks about the numbers of Prevent referrals on a northwest basis. And actually, if you look at the scale in terms of the amount of sort of Prevent referrals there have been on a national context, and if you drill down into the figures in terms of what actually leads to something, it's relatively small. One of the things that we've asked for, and it's a recommendation and a request from the Home Office, is to get the GM figures so we can be transparent, so we can share those with local communities. Because there is this, because of its nature, because of being in that sort of counter-terrorism space, there's an element of secrecy. I think there's a huge role to play in terms of myth-busting about what Prevent is, what it actually means in practice.
Thank you for that. And I'll open to any questions. Tim?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to explore Councillor Shorey, some of the issue in the report about a Greater Manchester Charter not being an effective way of addressing social cohesion. So I guess I don't 100% understand what a Greater Manchester Charter would be, so that's one issue, I guess. But so from what I'm understanding from the report, that the report seems to suggest that the Commission felt that it was best always to leave things to bottom-up responses, and the sort of Manchester Bee being a good example of that, and I understand that. But I suppose bottom-up responses are not always nice things. So, for example, the bottom-up response to the Brexit referendum in some communities was an increase in hate crime against EU nationals. So that's not a nice thing in my view, but that was a bottom-up response, isn't it? So I just wondered, there's a conflict between that, want to have a bottom-up response to things, but also our role as public bodies in wanting to provide leadership in that. So we could say, as public bodies in Greater Manchester, we want to have zero tolerance for hate crime, and that's the society we want. But that's actually a top-down thing we're saying, isn't it? So I just wonder, there's a conflict there, and your Commission was quite clear that a charter, whatever that is not the right way to do that. I just wanted to explore that a bit.
So I'll start by confessing I was a really big fan of having a charter initially. And I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you why I was wrong. So the idea of having a charter, so it's a charter, a set of values and principles. And it wasn't an original idea for this commission. It stemmed from a piece of work called Rethinking Radicalisation, which was a piece of work commissioned by Manchester City Council and conducted by the Peace Foundation. And the idea would be, Greater Manchester is a very diverse place. Having some direction centrally in terms of what Greater Manchester values are. Because if you read the introduction to the report, Greater Manchester does, a lot of people think Greater Manchester has its own sort of unique identity. We have a radical background, so on and so forth, suffragette movement, etc. We have our own set of values and principles. And if we had something that was pan-Greater Manchester, it would show the leadership you've talked about, it would set out behaviours we would expect and behaviour we wouldn't tolerate, and so on and so forth. So on the face of it, at a very superficial level, it sounded like a good idea. But then let's drill down into it. When we talk about identity, if you try and set out quite originally what identity is, then one thing can happen. You either fit within that identity or you don't. If you don't fit within that identity, then you're excluded from it, so it's not inclusive. If I look at my own identity, what's my identity? I'm British Indian, I'm from Greater Manchester, I'm from Bury, but I'm from Radcliffe, and Radcliffe people don't like Bury, and so on and so forth. I don't know if this is recorded, I'm sure that's a sweeping generalisation. However, same in Wigan. What, you hate Bury as well? Is it because of our world-famous market? Identity is, and sexuality and religious, identity is multifaceted. It is not, it wouldn't have been credible for us to try and, a lot of people, and this isn't a feedback, and you know, a lot of people didn't believe there was a Greater Manchester identity. You know, it was great after the arena attack to see that organic, the Manchester Bee, the Greater Manchester Bee, and so on and so forth. But the feedback we got from our communities, people didn't think they were Greater Mancunian. You know, if you're in Ramsbottom in Bury, you know, you think you're in Lancashire and so on and so forth. So to sort of suggest there should be a Greater Manchester Charter had many issues with it. So this idea about having, so identity is very complicated. And the idea that it has to be a bottom-up approach, I don't think there is a conflict. I don't think there is necessarily a conflict between saying, you know, actually in your own local communities, you know, you can set the tone of what happens there, what's acceptable, and so on and so forth. I don't think there's conflict between that and saying that you need a pan-Greater Manchester diktat. And let's talk about the practicality of this. And as I say, I know we perhaps could have got more, but to have 54 engagement events and, you know, 2,000 respondents, I think we've got to listen to people. That was really the feedback that we've got. That really, how effective is a charter? You know, sat in a room somewhere. We're currently consulting where we're consulted on a good employers charter and so on and so forth. What difference would it really make? I think the difference you make is by changing people's behaviours rather than sort of dictating what those behaviours should be. Because going back to that point I made in my introduction, what came out loud and clear is that people didn't feel like they could articulate themselves. You had people saying, well, we can't say X, Y and Z about, we can't comment on this Manchester Arena attack because we're worried about upsetting people. And you've got other parts of our community saying, you know, we feel really threatened by what's happened because we feel that we're being blamed and so on and so forth. I think if people don't feel like they can express themselves, then I think you only make that situation worse if you then try and impose, you know, a set of values and beliefs. I hope that answers your question.
Did that help you, Tim?
I don't know there is a right or wrong answer, but yeah.
Great. John Leach.
Thank you. First of all, can I say thank you for the presentation, because I think that brought some clarity to some of the issues that I would otherwise have raised. I've got one or two questions. The first was actually to do with the membership of the Commission and how it was decided who was going to be on it, because depending on how that was done, you could get a very different view of the outcome of any sort of report, depending on how it had been loaded. So, I mean, for instance, I've no no understanding as to why a philanthropist, the Shalni Aurora, was on the commission. Was there any particular way in which those people were selected? My second question, the only negative point I wanted to make about the report was in relation to page 22 and the key findings. The key findings 1.8 to 1.13 seemed to me blindingly obvious. And what I was disappointed in 1.8 was that it talked about there's no single cause or simple solution to the problem. Yes, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But why didn't we get a list of what were considered to be the causes and the solutions? I don't know whether that's in the full report, but we didn't get the full report. And then just picking up on the point that Tim said in relation to the charter, I think you convinced me by what you said, because I think I would have initially thought that a charter sounded like a good idea. But I just wonder, you made the point about people in Ramsbottom seeing themselves as being Lancastrians rather than Greater Mancunians. But that's about identity rather than value. So there may be shared values that I have with people in Ramsbottom, but not necessarily the shared identity. And then on page 29, you talked about a lack of clarity about exactly what prevent is. The second sentence, however, there is a perpetuating cycle of lack of information available to communities regarding prevent and circulation of inaccurate information. That seemed a bit of gobbledygook and a perfect example of a lack of clarity. And I do think there is definitely a lack of clarity about what prevent is all about. Partly, I think, because politicians haven't necessarily been very positive about it and have looked at the potentially negative side of some of the things that have come out that are in relation to prevent. And then two last points. One, about there was felt to be a lack of flexibility for intervention providers, and you did talk about that bit, but there wasn't any evidence put in the report as to why there wasn't any flexibility. Some examples would have been, I think, quite helpful, and maybe the full report goes into that. And then finally, just a question in relation to people would be more willing to speak to local neighbourhood police officers, and a suggestion that somehow police funding cuts is the reason that people don't do that. I'm not sure that that's strictly true. I think people are sometimes reluctant to share things with the police. Now, people who aren't reluctant maybe are finding it more difficult now, but I think that sometimes people don't feel as though they want to share things with the neighbourhood police officers. But perhaps they don't have that relationship that makes them feel confident about that. But I just wondered whether anything came out of, in terms of the report, anything came out from it about how we might tackle that so that people do know who to go to and that there is somebody going to be available for them to go to.
Thank you very much. So in terms of your first point about the selection criteria, so I helped put together the panel. So we announced we were going to have this commission in July, and so myself and the team at the Command Authority met a variety of people. What we wanted was a broad range of experience and expertise on the panel, and if you look at the membership contained at 1.4, so you've got Nazir Afzal, OBE, former Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West, who could bring expert experience in terms of the legal framework, the operation of Prevent. Saima Alvi, who's an educationalist and also the Vice Chair of the British Muslim Heritage Foundation. So she brought, it's a bit difficult if you've not read the full 140-page report, but obviously links to education and are key really in this journey in terms of social cohesion, aside from the issue of tackling radicalisation. Shalini Arora, one of the big issues, and I'll refer you to the Inclusive Growth Analysis Report, which came out in 2017, which I referred to in my opening remarks. That made clear that the life chances and opportunities for women and girls from BME communities in Greater Manchester is challenging, to say the least. And don't quote me on the statistics, but I think the average employment rate, if you're a white man in Greater Manchester, is about 75%. I think it drops about 50-odd% if you are from a BME background. If you're a BME woman, that's about 30%. So bearing in mind that one of the work streams of this commission was to look at how we improve social cohesion, I think it was important that we had someone with a knowledge and background. So her philanthropy, she runs an organisation called Savannah Wisdom, which is supported by Professor Ted Cantle, who actually coined the phrase community cohesion. In fact, he's advising the government on the new cohesion and integration network. We wanted someone who could bring a real focus to that specific agenda, so that's why Shalini was chosen. Nigel Bromwich, put my hands up, that was a brave move to have Nigel. He set up Combat 18, a former far-right extremist, because we wanted to show this isn't just focused on one type of extremism or radicalisation, but we want someone who could bring a real-life experience to some of the issues around how people get radicalised. And of course, we had Professor Hilary Pilkington, a noted academic on this subject, and there's a huge amount of academic research referred to in the report, which comes on to the question about we talked about, there's a comment about how some things are blindingly obvious. Well, you know, you referred to 1.8 of the covering report about radicalisation is not caused by a key driver. You know, there's a huge body of academic research, and a lot of it was referred to in the full report. You know, some people would argue that radicalisation is, and remember, this is an emerging theme. It's not until recent years people actually started looking and profiling people who've been radicalised and then gone on to commit terrorist attacks. So this is an emerging theme. So whilst it might sound obvious, isn't necessarily. You know, schools of thought that say that people who are in socially excluded groups, that poverty is a driver for radicalisation, that a lack of education is a driver for radicalisation. Well, actually, there isn't evidence to say that. However, there is evidence to say that the more or less socially inclusive your society is, the less social cohesion you have, actually that can lead to more instances of hate and perhaps radicalisation. So although it might sound obvious, you know, we spent 6 months trawling through, you know, years worth of academic research, it perhaps isn't as obvious as it may first appear. You mentioned a point about identity and values and the distinction. You talked about, you used my example, you know, people from Ramsbottom might think they're from Lancashire, that's an identity, but that's different from the values you may have. Well, one of the key things we get thrown back at us is British values, because being British is both an identity, but it's wrapped into the idea of a set of values, which is a massive turn-off to people. So it's not, I don't think you can make a distinction between identity and values. I think your identity, in a certain degree, would drive your values. And I'll give you an example of myself. I'm first generation, I don't know, I was born here, my parents weren't. Being anti-racist drives my values because of my parental background. That's my identity, but also drives your values, so they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Prevent, a lack of clarity on prevent. You see, what is prevent? Prevent is safeguarding and supporting vulnerable people to stop them from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism, and supporting the rehabilitation and disengagement of those already involved in terrorism. Now, actually, that's relatively clear. I think what has happened over the years, there has been a conflation and perhaps misinformation, fueled by the lack of information that we put out there about what prevent actually is. And I think, and that's the whole point about this communications toolkit, we need to go back to basics, really, to explain to people about what prevent is. Because no one would disagree, I would think, that safeguarding vulnerable people and supporting them, stopping them becoming involved in these sorts of things, is absolutely the right thing to do. So that's sort of why, when you explain the principles to people, no one disagrees with them. I think this lack of clarity about implementation, the perception that it targets specific communities, I think is something that we really do need to overcome. And if we do, I think actually we can have a much more effective system. I can't read my own writing now. Police and community support officers. This is covered more in the report, but we made a general point in my opening remarks about how there was a lack of places where people could go. The reason I think people mention police community support officers, and I can only speak from my experience as a ward councillor, when you had more police community support officers over the years, is that because they weren't seen as the police and because they had more time to be on the beat and build relationships, they were more accessible. And that links to the point I made in my earlier remarks about investment in youth provision and youth work. Having non-authority figures that people can speak to in a non-threatening manner makes them more accessible than simply reporting things into a criminal space, whether that be the police or whether it be counter-terrorism. And I would urge you to read, when you have the opportunity, the full report, because there's a huge body of sort of academic research that supports this idea that having networks in communities supported by the public services is a good way to build social cohesion and tackle a broad range of problems, not just radicalisation, but supporting vulnerable people, tackling antisocial behaviour, and so on and so forth. And I have missed out one of your.
There was the evidence of the, because it says there was felt to be a lack of flexibility for intervention providers for people who were classed as lower risk. I just wondered whether there are any examples of that.
I don't know if you want to. Yeah.
So my name's Sarah Barnes. I'm principal researcher for police crime and fire at the Combined Authority. I provided research support to the Cohesion Commission. The report goes into it in more detail than is obviously provided in the exec summary, but basically what it was felt was some of the stuff that Councillor Shorey was alluding to before, that quite often what we found was that people would not meet a threshold to be referred necessarily into a service. However, if you looked across kind of different services, they would have just missed the threshold on a number of services. And actually, if we were talking to each other a bit better, that maybe that person would have been picked up. However, what the actual report is alluding to there, with the point of intervention providers, is that Manchester City is what would be classed as a Tier 1 authority. The rest of our 9 local authorities are classed as a Tier 3. So Manchester gets more funding around extremism than the others, which gives them a bit more flexibility in how they can use their money. Whereas the other 9 local authorities, if they wanted to bring in an intervention provider, because they are classed as a lower tier and not kind of seen as more of a priority, there isn't the flexibility to intervene with those cases that don't quite meet the threshold. So if there's someone who we have concerns about, it might be that we have concerns about their mental health, their substance misuse, their physical health, and there's lots of concerns there. But currently the Home Office funding won't allow us to intervene with prevent funding for those people unless they meet the kind of threshold that would tip them over. So that's what it was talking about.
It was Mary next.
I just got a couple of brief points, really. The engagement issue, which I think is fundamentally important. The recommendation of having an annual get-together is all very well, but that doesn't actually tackle anything, in my opinion, unless the people that you're getting together are those that are out there engaging in the communities, which is where my interest lies. That's what we must do. It's no use sitting in rooms like this, really. This is not engagement at all, except amongst ourselves. And I'm very interested in getting some local engagement going in my particular area, where I think it would be it would be extremely helpful, and where there is good grounds for thinking that we could make some progress, because we already have fairly high levels of what I think is good community cohesion. I totally agree with your point about speaking to local neighbourhood police officers. We used to have 5 PCSOs. Now we're lucky if we see one, because the 2 that we're supposed to have are mainly being sent elsewhere, because the police is having to react to things. They have no time for doing preventative work. So their engagement with things like prevent is I would think, minimal, because it's essentially that is preventative work. The question I wanted to ask you, though, other than whether you think we could have a network of community engagement that reported up, and how we could develop that, is at this point on page 31, the role of women and girls in relation to extremism, including the role of mothers in addressing behaviours of concern. Now, I was a bit interested in that because I do know that women and girls, Muslim women and girls, are the ones that suffer the most from the casual hate crime that goes on in the street day in, day out, and that many women don't walk along our streets because they are more vulnerable. And that they do not report this. And I understand that because I have met with them and talked to them about this. And I want us to look in the future at how we enable women to feel safer, so that they feel they can walk and will not get comments, will not have their clothing disturbed, and all the rest of it. And actually, when I think about it, that probably applies to all women, but it applies more to Muslim women, particularly ones that wear a veil or the usual dress. And it happens in my area where wearing such things is commonplace. And I feel ashamed of the people that do that. And I'd like to sort out how we can engage with the women and girls in particular about issues like that, and how we get them to feel empowered.
I'm conscious of time because I've got the GM business plan. I've got Sheila, David, Annette and Colin in that order. I can't see you, and I don't know your name off the top of my head. Fred. And Fred. So, if you can keep it short and pithy, it will be very helpful. Sheila.
Yes, I'd like to agree, first of all, with what you were saying about the Greater Manchester Charter. I think people who, like myself, who actually come from Manchester and end up living in one of the outer boroughs, like Bury, sort of outer borough, I'm constantly amazed by the number of people I meet who've never moved outside Bury in their life and don't even really think of Manchester as part of their, you know, they tend to resent Manchester a bit, you know, the big brothers, big neighbours stopping them doing things. So I think you're right about the Charter. But my main question actually was, you mentioned the safeguarding and that they were hoping to at least pass some of the responsibility over to local authorities. And my immediate question, of course, was how is it going to be funded? So I was interested to hear you saying that if you can get the Home Office to give some more money for this, we can have more flexibility. But really, if they're just giving it to prevent, is it going to go into the local authorities and use the expertise that there is there? It's the local authorities who need the money. So first of all, how are you going to persuade the Home Office to give them some more money? And secondly, how are you going to persuade them to give them to the right people? Thank you.
So I'll take David, and then we'll take 2 lots of people. So I'll take David, and then you take the answers. Great.
Okay, we're on. Yes, it relates partly to a comment that was made before, and it's the people who don't quite meet intervention thresholds, that under that section, it then goes on to say, underlying mental health and or learning difficulties were a contributing factor to almost all of the channel referrals reviewed, which surprised me. I could expect that would be with some of them, but it surprised me. I'm a Safeguarding League governor in a school where I'm chair, and in all the prevent stuff that we've done in that context, that's never been anything that's been apparent, and I think it's quite significant. But again, anecdotally, and perhaps through one or two cases that I personally had knowledge of, it seems to be in some cases of radicalisation, particularly online, the people involved have been intelligent and not materially deprived, but socially isolated, vulnerable, naive, etc. So I was interested that figure of almost all came out, and I wonder if there's any more information behind that, because it was quite surprising to me.
Could I just answer that? It was interesting about underlying mental health problems with people that had been referred to prevent. It'd be interesting to know, to link that to there's been enough people radicalised across the spectrum from the Irene attack to the Joe Cox incident and all manner of stuff in between. Were there actually underlying mental health problems? Would you know the answer to that? Because surely that would be almost a better pointer rather than who was just referred into prevent.
In terms of the question about community engagement, I think something that came out, well, it did come out very loudly and clearly, was how we engage and not just go to the usual suspects in specific communities. We all know in all communities across Greater Manchester, you know, those that are actively engaged, there's some people who take leadership roles and so on and so forth. And there's a real need to sort of get under the skin of communities and sort of hear their real voice. And I say that specifically in relation to women and girls as well, because in some communities that is more difficult. I mean, the report makes clear, just in terms of this issue about PCSOs and so on and so forth. We know they're a fantastic resource. Maybe they're not there in the numbers that they used to do. But it's worthwhile that we've acknowledged that. And then how do we find a community-focused solution? How do we engage the third sector? How do we maybe look to divert more resources to various aspects to try and fill that gap? Because I think that there is a gap, and I think that's clearly come out in terms of the outcomes of the report and the consultation that we received. So I think I don't have the answers. I think the idea of creating some sort of community engagement network across GEM is something that we can take forward. But I think we need to get the principles of engagement right to ensure that we're engaging as many different types of communities within GM. The funding for Dovetail and the rollout of the second pilot, as I understand it, there is resource that goes with it. I think it's a good point. I think it'll be for the Mayor of Greater Manchester and the Deputy Mayor and the Chief Executive to do the negotiations, but it is a fair point. What we don't want is a shift of responsibility without resource, but it is an overwhelmingly positive step, I believe. You know, we're talking about the context of mental health and so on and so forth. We are skilled in that area. Remember, Prevent Channel is a voluntary process. Not criminalising it at the outset, I think, will help ameliorate some of those feelings of spying and criminality when that necessarily isn't the case. In relation to, I think I'll hand over to you, Sarah, about the channel referral, and the peer review that we did. It is interesting that mental health does have a huge role to play. From the latest update I got from Bury, I think we had 6 channel referrals, and they all had underlying mental health linked to them. But I think that just makes the point about the need for a greater safeguarding approach and a more holistic approach to how we support vulnerable adults, rather than just looking at it as, well, this is a counter-terrorism issue, you know, this is a radicalisation issue, and rather than looking at the broader vulnerabilities and things that impact on those people's lives.
So, just for anyone who isn't aware, Prevent would be, you can refer into Prevent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you go into Channel. So Channel would be the intervention programme that's wrapped around the Prevent agenda. So the Channel peer reviews is a process that we did. It actually started before the commission started, but we felt that the learning would be really valuable. So we fed it in, and what we did was we went around to all 10 local authorities, and we we asked the local authorities to present some of the cases that they'd had referred into their channel process, of which the vast majority had mental health difficulties as a reporting factor. So some of the things you're saying that anecdotally, not necessarily all mental health would be involved, that would be true with regards to radicalisation. And I think it's just also important to remember where kind of channel sits. It sits usually, it's just below the threshold of criminalisation. So quite often things that you're talking about, where one thing that we do know is that the people who are more intelligent, better articulated, things like that, have a better educational background, they're more likely to tip over into that criminalisation space. So it might be that they skip the prevent agenda completely. But what we did find, and what the statistics that we have at the Northwest level suggest, is that actually the vast majority of referrals into prevent are deemed that it's not necessarily a prevent issue. It might be that they go back to, if it's, for example, a school, that we go back with a bit of advice about how to support that young person. It's not necessarily a thing that this person's a risk of radicalisation. It just might be that they've, quite often we'd hear that they'd said something either racist or something a bit silly with regards that they brought a bomb to school, for example, something like that. And the school quite rightly put safeguarding provision in place to refer them into prevent, but actually there's no necessarily risk with that person once it's been explored. But yeah, mental health was found to be a really big contributor, and I agree with your point about that. Actually, maybe we don't, in training, we don't give enough dedication to that. One thing that was really, really obvious from the channel peer reviews is that although the people were linked to safeguarding with regards to radicalisation, in reality that safeguarding process could have related to any of our vulnerabilities that people are likely to be drawn into and groomed into. It's just that the person who had targeted them towards radicalisation, almost always online, as you say. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Annette, Colin, and then Fred, and then you can answer if that would be good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you probably already answered this as far as you can. But what I was going to talk about this bottom-up, top-down sort of approach, because I think you are talking about a very, very bottom-up approach with this. If you're going to look at things in those terms, because you're talking about people who are not necessarily going to engage with anybody. Certainly with people who say the community leaders or the running community organisations. So I don't know if you can answer this, possibly not. But how are we going to ensure that things are introduced at a very, very localised level, reaching out to these people who have said to you that they aren't being listened to, because they're probably not being listened to by anybody. So I don't know whether we've got to that point of this, but if you could answer that. And the other thing was about this phone line, with the same sort of idea of you take it outside of the police, take it outside the criminal justice system, but if you're introducing something new, why would anybody trust that? And how are we going to put that forward to people in a way that they might feel that they're able to engage with it? And just my final point, which probably isn't for you, is why have we not got the full report? Because I think it would have been very helpful for us to have had the whole report prior to this meeting, if that was possible.
It was included at the back of the papers as a link, so we have effectively had it. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is actually a very wide-ranging and comprehensive report. My worry is that it does require a significant degree of sustained funding over a prolonged period if it's going to actually achieve a great deal of success. But there are also elements of repetition, if you like, within the report, with issues that have cropped up on previous occasions, which we're still looking to address. If I can give you one small example, on page 23, the second bullet point talks about, again, extending free transport for 16 to 18-year-olds to remove access, to improve access, really, I think it should be saying, to affordable transport, or remove the access to the barriers. But I can remember when we were still operating under AGMA that we were talking about this when we were looking at employment and training. and we were talking to TFGM at that point about the possibility of reduced cost for transport of 16 to 18-year-olds, linked to further education provision, etc., across Greater Manchester. And here we are again, still talking about the same issue. And there are other examples within the report. But I wonder to what extent we're going to be talking about that issue, for example, in another 3 years, having been talking about it for a previous 3 years. And as I say, there is an underlying issue relating to funding as to how we're going to deliver on the recommendations that are embodied in the report. And we're living in what you might call financially challenging times, and we're not necessarily going to get the support that we require from central government. How are we going to find it from within Greater Manchester's budget in order to deliver this kind of ambitious, laudable programme, top down, bottom up, middle outwards, whichever way you want to look at it, it's going to be tackled in a variety of different ways, but somehow we have to come together and find a means of identifying the resources to make it possible.
Fred?
Yeah. Actually, if we could implement this report, it includes sorting out most of the social woes of Greater Manchester, and it'd be wonderful. You know, and the real world, unfortunately, is life's never like that. I am glad your researcher made the simple point that some of these people are highly educated. You know, we mustn't think that every one of them is a deprived, mentally ill person, you know, because it's just not the case. But my biggest concern is if we're going to do some ongoing work here, I want us to understand how we measure the impact of it. Because it's great to have someone whirring away in the background, but if you can't measure it, you know, who knows whether it was any good or not. So I'd like to understand how we're going to measure that. I mean, what we have to recognise is that the big incidents only happen every Preston Guild. So you can't just say, well, we haven't had one for 5 years. You know, I'm sure in the background we're always hearing on the television that the stuff that stops happening, and perhaps we can measure that even if we can't get to know the detail of it. So if we know that normally there's 20 in Greater Manchester and now we've got it down to 10, that's, you know, I'm happy with that without wanting to know the absolute detail. But I just want a way of measuring the impact of what we're proposing to try and do here.
Well, that question first. The measure of success of this is not stopping a terror attack. A report cannot stop a terror attack. In a global world where people can travel around the world, this report can't do that. The measure of success for a report like this, in terms of improving social cohesion, is looking at the delivery of the Greater Manchester strategy and the priorities within that. So level of early years, good level of development, employment rates, crime rates, etc. That is how we can evidence with metrics, the systems we've got in place at the moment, whether or not we are successful about creating a socially cohesive society. And social cohesion is people who feel able to participate democratically, people who feel that they've got the same opportunities as other people and they aren't held back and so on and so forth. That is how you measure success. And I just want to make that point because it's a really good one. This isn't about us as a Greater Manchester community being able to stop a terrorist attack. We may be able to stop people being radicalised. We may be able to give more support and safeguard vulnerable adults. But that task, I'm afraid, is beyond this report. So how do we measure success? It's by looking at how we deliver on the outcomes of the Greater Manchester strategy, which then comes on to your point about, well, how do you deliver some of this? And to your point, well, how do you get to the grassroots? How do you do this? This all should be looked at in the context of our public service reform agenda. We need to be looking at things like social isolation and mental health and access to apprenticeships and access to the job market and educational outcomes. That is how you tackle these issues. You know, we talked about inequality in Greater Manchester. 21% of Greater Manchester's neighbourhoods are in the top 10 most deprived. in the country. There is a huge body of work to do. Even in Bury, 1 in 4 children still live in poverty. It's not necessarily about spending more money, it's using it more smartly. And the big mistake we will make is looking at this report in isolation rather than integrating it into the mainstream work of what all our councils of the combined authority and public services do. I take your point about the phone line. In terms of the immediate response to the report, the Mayor and Deputy Mayor said they endorsed the principle and will look into the feasibility of it. I think, using our new community engagement principles, I think we need to sell the point that this is about offering advice. It's not about criminalising. It's about actually, if you've got a concern about someone and you want to report it, but rather, if you need someone who may need some help, ring this number and let us make the judgment. You know, it's not for the people out there, our public, our residents, to make a judgment about whether or not somebody's being radicalised, etc. It's about ensuring they get the right support at the right place at the right time. And at the moment, that isn't happening because various parts of our community don't feel like they can enter this space. They don't feel it's accessible to them because they don't want to criminalise the friends or the relatives and so on and so forth. And what we're saying is that it doesn't have to be like that.
I had loads, but we've run out of time. Any more? Pressing? That excellent. I think we could have done the whole meeting on it. And maybe we will return to it, given our own pressures, maybe we won't. But it was excellent. I appreciate your time, so thank you for that. Without any further ado, I'm going to move on to Eamon for GMCA Business Plan.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll try and be brief. Could I just start with an apology for the late circulation of the detailed work plans, all that vast wad of detail at the back, which I'm sure just lie awake reading. But I'm very happy to respond either to any queries now or by correspondence on the detail of those work plans. The business plan itself tries to set out the overarching work priorities which are encapsulated in the Greater Manchester strategy that Councillor Shorey referred to, and every single action and priority in the business plan links back to the 10 key objectives in the GMS. The business plan does try and focus on what the CA does, but also makes clear that success, and again, go back to what Councillor Shorey was referring to, just as an example, success in and around our public service reform agenda is fundamentally something that we can enable, but it can only be delivered by all public sector partners working together. What the business plan does not do is set out detailed operational plans for health, transport, policing or fire. That they're dealt with separately, but you will see within here the overall strategic approach that we're taking through things like the Office of the PCC to the way in which we're developing the policy agenda, sitting behind the policing and fire plan as we move forward. Page 5 in the report that you've seen sets out some of the achievements to date, and then just moving rapidly through the remainder of the paper. To emphasise that we give great priority to what we're calling our people and our people work. I mean, what we've got is quite a complex organisation. We brought together a wide range of organisations, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service being by far and away the most substantial in terms of numbers and budget. The Office of the PCC, the Waste Disposal Authority, AGMA, New Economy, a wide range of other delivery and policy teams, and the Office of the Mayor. And that brings with it a whole range of diverse cultures, work practices and procedures and processes that we are trying to rationalise as we develop our people overall. That underpins the work that we're doing in terms of business as usual, but it also underpins the improvement programmes that we're pushing forward, and there's a comprehensive programme of improvement and integration going on across all of the functions of the CA, and that's to ensure the greatest integration of functions at a GM level to optimise value for money and to focus on delivery of the key priorities set out in the Greater Manchester strategy. So we are looking at how we can rationalise and integrate the functions of predecessor organisations, but also working with other GM partners, including GM Police, Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership, and TFGM, to look at how we can work across those organisations more effectively in order to deliver best value to you as funders of the overall enterprise and to the people people of Greater Manchester. And just one example there, we're currently working with the Health and Social Care Partnership to look at how effectively most of their back office functions can be incorporated within the CA as we move forward. Page 9 of the paper, page 43 in the pack, sets out our finances and the agreed budget for 2018-19. Amounts to over 1.6 billion if you add in revenue and capital, so it's huge in that regard. While a very substantial proportion of that resource is paid for by GM taxpayers through levies, precepts and such like, worth just mentioning briefly that the core budget for the GMCA and AGMA, because we still have AGMA to retain, which we retain to maintain those functions that have not been transferred by statute to the GMCA, it's about 9.6 million. Of that, 6 million is your contribution towards the GM Cultural Fund. So the net contribution of the 10 authorities into the core budget of the CA is actually just around £4 million. All of the rest of the budget is raised, and there's a lot more activity that the CA undertakes around the new economy and such like, but it's all externally funded through contract and such like. The other element that this budget does not include is the growth company, who are an independent entity that sit within the family, but effectively are entirely funded through contract income. They employ about 1,000 people on work around business support, employer engagement, working with skills providers across Greater Manchester. The numbers that you see there do include the total budget for GMP under the PCC heading. That's in theory how we account for GMP's budget. As you can see, it's by far and away the single biggest entity in that funding picture. Page 45 just lists the teams, and then the detailed work plans are in the annex which was circulated later to you. But just some key priorities for this year, which we'll be taking forward. I'm going to remind people about how unpopular I can be when we go out to consultation on the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework again, subject to agreement with leaders at the end of October. We are working very hard through the digital team. We had a very successful digital summit very early in the Mayor's term. We've been successful in putting together an investment fund of just around 40 million to roll out full fibre to the premises. It's to link public sector premises together right the way across GM, but we're hoping to do it in a way that makes sure that the fibre passes as many private residences and private businesses as it possibly can on its way between those public sector premises to create a network and a skeleton to enable us to roll out full fibre. And we hope by 2020 to have gotten to a position where between 25 and 30% of all premises in GM will have direct fibre to the premise, not to the cabinet and then copper, but direct fibre to the premise. And that's compared to about 3% now. It'll get us nowhere near some of our European competitors, but we will be the most connected city in the UK in respect of full fibre. I've already mentioned the work on the reform team are doing and coordinating with your teams around the enhanced work and health programme, start well and early years programmes, working on life readiness, which is fundamentally about school leavers and young adults and training and education. And also incorporated within the CA is the Greater Manchester Ageing Hub, who have been recognised nationally for the work that they're doing around the age-friendly agenda, which the City of Manchester led on, which is now being picked up by GM moving forward. The resilience team internationally recognised. We're now part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which is a global network of cities recognised for the work they're doing on civil contingencies and resilience. And we are continuing our work on ensuring that our infrastructure plans recognise the threat of global warming and climate change, but also in the shorter term we're focusing on what our contingency plans ought to be in the event of a hasty exit from the European Union. On a no-deal scenario, we are looking at the implications for Greater Manchester, as well as working with the NHS, looking at implications for the NHS nationally and other agencies. So that's a key short-term priority for us. Just a few other things to mention. On waste, we're working hard to procure a new contractual arrangement to support waste disposal. You'll be aware, I hope, that we've been successful in concluding the waste PFI arrangements, which will save all of the constituent authorities, sorry, not Wigan, some substantial sums moving forward. And a big priority for us on the skills agenda is the implementation of the devolved adult education budget, which finally arrives next year, 5 years after it was agreed with the government that it would arrive. So it just shows that some trains do move slowly, but some of them do arrive at the end of the day. So that will be around about £90 million per annum that we will have direct control over its deployment, working with skills providers from next year onwards. On the strategy side, the only thing I would highlight is the fact that we, along with West Midlands and the Oxford and Cambridge corridor, have been invited by government to bring forward a local industrial strategy in advance of the national industrial strategy. We're working very hard on that with a number of key partners. We believe that will help us significantly influence the national growth strategy post-Brexit and influence the way in which government deploys resources moving forward. You may be aware that the government is proposing to replace all of the European regional and structural funds with something called the Shared Prosperity Fund. European funding is worth around about £100 million a year to the GM economy. And once you think of match funding, it's double that amount. And so we're making the case for us to receive not only a fair share of that Shared Prosperity Fund, equivalent to what we've been currently getting, but also to try and make certain that there's an effective ability for us to shape that at a place level. And the last thing I would touch on as a key priority for us moving forward for the CA, supporting colleagues in GMFRS on completing the extensive work of review that's been undertaken post the Kerslake review, in which Dawn and Leon and colleagues have been working with us extremely hard. So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour for what it is that the business plan sets out, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Questions? John?
Thank you, Chair. Just a question in relation to the reduction in carbon footprint. It doesn't go into any detail about how you measure success and what sort of reductions the authority is actually looking at.
If you look at the output of the Green Summit that was held earlier in the year, we have announced our intention, and it is an ambitious intention, to achieve carbon neutrality 7 years ahead of the government's national target. And we are working on strategies around energy, local energy generation, around how we can work with bus providers to reduce carbon emissions from the transport fleet. So there are a number of things that are underway. I can make sure that you receive a written response, Councillor Leach, which sets out in a bit more detailed specific targets behind that.
How do the partners of the combined authority fit within that and that strategy?
All the partners have signed up to the overall strategy that came out of the Green Summit. It's been the subject of detailed discussion with leaders and continues to be so.
Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Have the combined authority got the power to raise money by borrowing? And on page 43, your finances, your current budget and the 3-year capital programme. Does any of that rely on borrowing, or is it all that grants and money coming in? And the third part I was going to ask, which you've answered, is how at risk are we from the Brexit and losing European money? But you've already answered that question. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say that the process whereby the powers that have been agreed by government through the various devolution deals, the means by which they're being delivered is a little bit erratic. So we still do not have power to borrow at GM level. It's promised, and there's an order being drafted, but it's not yet been laid before Parliament. And to be frank, without being in any way political, The reality is that the entire machinery of government is now obsessed with managing the Brexit process, and therefore we've been told in categoric terms that those orders will not be laid in the near future. So, just as an example, if we wish to borrow money in respect of investment in housing and property, effectively we do that with Manchester City Council acting as our bank manager for that. So that the powers are not here there. Some of the capital sums that you see are dependent upon borrowing undertaken by either via Manchester or via TFGM. But the bulk of those sums there are actually related to grants, such as the Transforming Cities Fund grant and growth deal monies, direct grants to police and others. So the issue of concern for us is, can we maintain our position in respect of the investment capability post-exit from the European Union as we've had previously? And this, I think the signs are good. The worry that we have, if I'm being frank with you, is that the sum of money is okay, but the flexibility that we have to deploy that in a way that makes sense for us in GM is less than it might otherwise be. So that's what we're arguing for at the moment, a flexible approach to investment that can enable us to meet our priorities.
Thank you.
Tim?
Thank you, Chair. So I think we would all agree that the growth of the combined authority has been hugely impressive, I guess, in terms of all the money that's come in, and it's a credit to everybody involved, I guess. My one wonder is that back at our 10 ranches, I guess, and as you know very well, that's not how it feels, is it? Because the trajectory over a decade at least has been the opposite of growth in local authorities, with us shedding staff and us shedding resources. And I'm just wondering, at some point, do we need to reflect that that there are some things, with some of the resources that the combined authority is able to attract in, which should actually really are better delivered at in Oldham, or are better delivered in Chadderton or something like that, that in actual fact we're great at bringing resources into Greater Manchester, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the centre has to grow and grow and grow. And I think it's fine that it does at the beginning, but at some point, we need to be giving some of this decision and resources back to a lower level. I think it's just, I suspect you agree, but it's just that this level of growth, it feels like it's all coming into the centre, and I think over time we need to just reflect and go back outwards again.
Don't want to be defensive about that. Net growth in the CA from what I inherited when we created the organisation has been zero. What we have seen is the absorption of more functions. So more responsibility function has come our way. So the Waste Disposal Authority, for example, has come in. The commissioning hub from the Health Partnership has come in. And so we've seen growth as a result of that. But actually in net terms, there's been no growth. And certainly there has been no growth in the requirement for core funding from local authority partners. Having said that, I'm very conscious, as I said earlier on, that the big numbers that you see in the budget are very largely dependent upon Greater Manchester and local authority taxpayers paying precepts and levies in order to meet those costs. So we are very conscious of the need to try and make certain that we are controlling those and seeking to reduce those where we can.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Eamon, there's been a lot happening these last 12 months. It's fantastic to see what progress has been made. But I particularly am interested in attracting business to the region so that we are more successful than the West Midlands. And I wonder what local enterprise partnerships have a part to play in this. And how do you see us going forward in attracting business to this as a region, I'm talking as a region, to ensure jobs and skills are being delivered by the combined authority? And have you got any comment to make regarding the situation on Brexit?
Well, I don't think I want to get drawn any further into commenting on Brexit, to be honest. I think that's possibly for others in the room. I mean, our focus on maintaining growth is very, very strong. And Midas, as part of the growth company itself, the investment funds that we've deployed, including the very successful Evergreen funds, where we've used ERDF resources, European Regional Development Fund resources, in what's acknowledged as the most successful financial instrument in Europe to generate growth, continue. And we are still seeing rates of growth in certain sectors and in certain places, because it's not evenly spread across the conurbation, as you well know, that outstrip most other parts of the country. But we know that we've got to keep our foot to the floor, because that environment will become more challenging as we move forward. We are very hopeful that we're now having a much more constructive dialogue with the Department for Education and government nationally around skills, apprenticeships and adult education than we've ever had before. I think we are in a good place to be able to make sure that we're shaping the skills provision that's available to local people to enable them to engage more actively in the economy than we have been in previous years. So I'm optimistic about that.
Thanks.
Anne?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation so far, Eamon. I suppose, as some of my colleagues have said, it's been a very busy sort of first year or so, and I'd just be interested in your thoughts around where your biggest challenges have been, but also a little bit to touch on a little bit more of the risk management, one around the budgets, but also around just managing an organisation that's as big as this, and then just around also what the biggest impacts have been. Do you think what's the difference? I'm just picking up on Tim's point about the fact that our residents maybe sometimes don't still know what the combined authority is, don't really know what it means. They're paying money, they're paying precepts, but don't really see how that translates to them on the ground. And as life gets challenging and difficult within local authorities, and they see money coming up and being sucked into a centre, whether or not there's more or less than before, there's still a thing that actually, if I live in Old Trafford and I live in Stretford, what does this mean for me, and how are the comms being done around some of that work to make sure that people know that there's a value to the combined authority. Thank you.
Just a simple measure of value, and I think we do need to think about how we communicate this better. And I appreciate the last thing that most of your constituents want to do is to talk about local government structures, and none of us do either. But if we did not have a mayoral combined authority, we would not have the ability to retain 100% of our business rate growth. Now this year, that's worth collectively to us around about £42 million that we would not otherwise have. And I'm reminded on a daily basis by all of your leaders that I spend only what proportion of that they direct me to on specific projects, and the rest goes back to the districts. Next year, that will be worth around £60 million to us. So there's £100 million of net benefit, financial direct benefit back to local authorities that would not have happened had we not adopted the CA structure. So I haven't done anything about that. It's just been what's flowed from the government's approach to devolution and an approach to the 100% rate retention pilots. So I think that's a very, very important issue for us. The big priorities for me and where we are now are contained within the GMS, contained within the local industrial strategy. Fundamentally, they're about maintaining our growth trajectory and continuing to grow the economy, but more significantly, driving the reform agenda in such a way that we are doing everything that we can to enable more of our citizens to benefit from that growth than we have in the past. And I think that's quite a significant shift that leaders have been very keen to promote over the last over the last couple of years, truth be told, to try and make certain. So the reform agenda around early years and the work which we're doing with all of your children's services, the work that we're doing with all of your teams around skills and life readiness, as we're calling it, as people leave education, I think are at the absolute bedrock of where we are. The other thing I would highlight as being an absolute priority front and centre for us, and we are a partner in this, is the successful delivery of some of the reshaping of the health and social care agenda, which is massively important to us and massively important to the quality of life for citizens. And I think that's an area where hopefully we'll start to be able to deliver some real and tangible improvement. And we're seeing that in some places already.
Just me now. I know at the point we've been invited to put together an industrial strategy. It does seem to me that and I know the lines are blurred between the CA and the Mayor, and other mayors have different levels of responsibility. The West Midlands Mayor has pursued more of an industrial strategy and has, for instance, got 250 million for the development of batteries for cars, etc., complete with a college on the back of it. I see a social strategy being driven by our Mayor, but without the industrial strategy, the social bit is always going to struggle, because the industrial strategy and the spatial framework for that matter, because that is also driven by the growth that is needed. I think it's quite key. Have you any comments on that?
I think comparing mayors is not something that I'm going to get drawn into, to be perfectly honest. But if I might, I mean, I think there are things that we need to recognise. I mean, firstly, some of this, and this is me going to get critical, some of the success that's been claimed for the West Midlands Combined Authority would have happened anyway. The investment into batteries has not gone to the Mayor, it's gone into primes in the automotive industry. Now, the West Midlands is full of automotive primes. We have no primes in our economy at all. It's a much, much smaller, more diverse economic base. I would say that you're right, that the Mayor, Mayor Burnham, is very focused on a social agenda as well as an economic agenda, and that's something that I think it will be a strong feature of the rest of his term, and help to shape the priorities. I have to say he has been strongly supported by leaders in that agenda, but we are very focused on the industrial strategy, and again, at the risk of sounding critical of my friends in the West Midlands, what they have done for their industrial strategy is simply listed their primes and said these are the areas that need support. We have commissioned an independent economic review to really get into the ribs of what our future risks look like in terms of our economy, to inform that, and I think to drive what will be a much more robust strategy than you will see in other places.
I do sort of appreciate the automotive primes. You can't get away from that. But if we look at ourselves, and it hasn't been driven home, we've got aerospace, to be fair, in Lancashire, but that spills over. Digital in the city centre is massive. We've got distribution at the airport, and that's just off the top of my head without even trying to drill down into it and develop an industrial strategy, potentially recycling we've got over, I don't know, Haywood area. That is just, there's been no mood music, and that mood music is important when trying to attract independent investment.
I hear what you say. I mean, I think if you look at the development of the logistics business on the west side of the conurbation, primarily around Logistics North in Bolton, who funded it? The CA did. If you look at the growth in Grade A floor space within the conurbation core, who has funded it? The CA has. If you look at the airport city and an investment in and around the development of the logistics businesses there, who's invested in that? The CA has. So I think we have maintained a very, very strong focus on our investment in growth. We maybe haven't trumpeted that as well as we might otherwise have done. But the reality is that those investment funds that we have created and have operated extraordinarily well, we've currently got something in the region of £1 billion out there invested in economic and housing growth that would not be happening had it not been for the initiatives taken by leaders who have sanctioned everything that the CA does.
Thank you. Any more from the floor? That's great. So, thank you for that. Thank you for the comprehensive report. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service.
Good evening, everybody. It might seem a bit odd that we've brought a report into accelerated firefighter recruitment here, but what I hope to do tonight is to explain why we needed to recruit so many firefighters, how we're achieving this, and most importantly, to reassure you that we continue to try and target a diverse workforce for Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. We want it to be a career of choice for men, women, and from all our communities. We recognise that we started from a very low base. Probably only 2% of our workforce were not white male, and we are working very hard to make a difference to those figures. So, why did we need to recruit that target of 332 firefighters. The previous fire authority had agreed an integrated risk management plan which sought to remove 6 fire engines from Greater Manchester over a period of time. And so that there wouldn't be any compulsory redundancies, then there had been an agreed policy that we would not recruit or we would recruit in lower numbers so that when the time came, which was supposed to be April 2018, that those appliances would be removed, then there would not be an excess of firefighters. That was working to that plan, though what actually happened was that more firefighters left us than we expected. We normally see about 90 retire, but we have realised that in the most recent years we are seeing more than those 90 go. People are no longer doing their 30 years service in the fire service. They are moving on to other jobs. They are deciding that they are going to, in effect, cash in their pensions because they don't are not convinced that their pension will be not changed, as we have seen over the few years. So we had actually lost more firefighters than we needed to. And also, when in December 2017, the Mayor decided to suspend that plan because he wanted to look at the information behind that and to decide whether that was the plan that he would want to pursue. We were left in that position where we had the fire engines, but we didn't have the firefighters to crew them. So that would account to about 120 of those firefighters. And then, as I say, we were looking to lose about 90 over the 2-year period, which gets us to around the 300 mark. And because it's a moving target and it's a lot easier to actually focus and go for a fixed target, we came up with that number of 332. So in the meantime, while we do that accelerated recruitment, because you can't just go and pluck a fully trained firefighter off the street, and we need to recruit, and we need that 16-week training programme, then the Mayor brought in interim overtime in order to make sure that we had firefighters on those appliances. But that was always an interim measure. So we needed to ensure that we could recruit those numbers. And you can see on page 49 that we got off to a rather slow start. So in January, we recruited 27, and they are now fully trained and they're on stations in Greater Manchester. And that we are currently training 37, and they are due to complete their training in mid-September and to go onto stations. We recognise we needed to up our game. So our current recruitment process, we have attracted 55 new recruits. They're in the position of being offered contracts. They will also, they actually attracted another 25, and they will start with the January course. But we also tried to go for inter-service transfers. So what that is we put an advert out and to see if other firefighters from other fire and rescue services would want to transfer to Greater Manchester. We have had an incredible success. We like to think that it's because we are very much a high-profile service, and we have attracted, as I say, over 50 inter-service transferees. We do recognise that other fire and rescue services are doing the same thing, so they're out offering incentives for trained firefighters to come to them. So, although we are very pleased at the success of attracting 50, we do recognise that we might lose some of our firefighters, because often people relocate to where they live, having moved to a different fire service in order to be trained and become that part of their fire service, and they then want to go back to their home service, which is perfectly understandable. As I say, we've already got 25 firefighters for the January training course, 2019, and another 25 for the inter-service training course in January. We aim to attract 55 for May and September, and then complete in January 2020. At that point, we will be at the level that we require, but also we will have worked with our colleagues and leaders and yourselves through the programme for change to develop what the operating model will look like for Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. So at that point, we will know just how many appliances and firefighters we will need for the future to make this sustainable. So that is our plan. And as I say, I'd like to reassure you that we have kept in mind our need to attract a diverse workforce. We are still working very much with the police and also using our taster days to attract people to come along and find out what it is to work for a fire and rescue service. Many people don't realise that what we do around prevention needs the communication skills as much as any strength skills that are required. And as just before the paragraph on the conclusion, over the 3 courses from January to September this year, an average of 28% of the new recruits have been from underrepresented groups, and that's far higher than the national average. So, happy to take any questions, Chair.
Peter, do you want to declare your interest?
Sorry?
You want to declare your interest before you go?
Well, yeah, I'm in receipt of a fire brigade pension, so yeah, I'm a bit biased. But certainly your introduction to Greater Manchester Fire Service, I bet you've never had a much more interesting 2 years than the last 2 years you've had. But a couple of just 2 simple questions. Obviously, the 90 who are leaving are of different ranks, and the 332 are coming in are firefighters. Are you having any trouble filling your ranks with suitably trained staff, or are you finding, you know, that there's gaps in the training and the development of officers as you progress through? Part 1. Part 2 is what ratio of applicants are you getting? How many applicants are you getting for each individual post? Is it seriously oversubscribed, or well? Thank you.
Do you include women as in your underrepresented group? And if so, which I thought you probably did, I've never been called an underrepresented group before, by the way, is how many of your 28% are female?
John.
A couple of points. Just in terms of the inter-service transfers, it doesn't actually say how many we've lost. Have we lost any so far? And if so, how many? And then by 2020, what proportion of the whole fire service will be from underrepresented groups? And why haven't we had a sort of table of, you know, numbers, actual numbers, so that we can compare current numbers and potential future numbers?
I'll throw mine in as well at the same time. So by 2020, we've got 354. Is that less than 90 a year? So is that less 180 effectively? We were losing 90. Are we losing 90 a year?
We're losing actually more than that.
Okay, so are those taken into account? So will we have? So we will have recruited something like 500.
No, sorry, the 332 included replacing those 90.
Fine, right, okay, thank you.
Question around promotion. certainly as we bring firefighters in, we expect people to work through the system and go for promotion. We very much encourage people to go through our promotion processes. We are looking to refine them because, and I don't mean that we'll intend to make it simpler, because obviously we want to have the right skills at each level, but certainly we will need to make it very clear to people what it is that they need to do in order to make themselves and prepare themselves as suitable candidates for the next role within the service. So we're certainly working at making promotion an attractive thing to do, but also very understandable rather than what may have appeared to be rather convoluted processes in the past. Number of applicants per post. This is different to if we were to go out to open recruitment, which you might be familiar with and which fire services have done in the past. The difficulty with going to open recruitment is that you can get thousands of applicants for, say, 50 posts. And you spend an awful lot of time deselecting those people. Because we wanted to target people, we restricted the ability to apply to people who had either worked as a volunteer for Greater Manchester Fire Service or had come to one of our taster days or had some connection with us, so that we had given them input into this is what it is to be a firefighter and this is how we expect that your fitness levels and your aptitude should be. So actually when they came to the assessment centre and the interviews, they were far better prepared as candidates, and therefore we were not losing the numbers that we would traditionally do so in an open recruitment process. So there's far fewer candidates going through the recruitment process, but they're of better quality and a larger proportion of them end up with a job at the end of it. Which is why, yeah, as I recognise, the idea that women are underrepresented groups is ridiculous in our society. But I'm afraid the position in the fire service is they are very much underrepresented. And we needed to show that actually this could be a career of choice, and that people's traditional view of what a firefighter does is very far of the mark in this day and age. We're really about prevention as much as response. I think you're asking what of that 28% were female. I can't answer that here, but I can get you that figure and send it on to you. My gut feeling is it's about 50%.
I was thinking that that probably ties in with the question that was asked by Councillor Leach here, that in terms of, you know, looking at the overall numbers and, if you like, the different categories of underrepresented.
Yeah. Do you want to come out performance? Yeah.
Just in terms of, we bring a quarterly performance report on fire and rescue service performance to this meeting, and within that report there's a workforce section, and we bring them the breakdown in that report. What we've done for this report is just pull that together in a summary figure.
What that report hasn't included is the number of inter-service transfers that we have lost, because actually the numbers have been so small at the moment, but we recognise that all fire and rescue services are in the same boat at the moment, and we expect that those numbers will increase, and therefore if we can add that to give you a better picture of, you know, these are the numbers we're getting, but these are the ones that we are losing, both through retirements, moving on to other services or indeed other forms of employment. And I think that will give a better picture. And similarly with what proportion by 2020, we are currently at about 5%. I said, you know, we started at about 2% of our workforce. Is it 5 or is it higher than that now?
No, it must be around 5.
it is something that we have to work at because we need to represent the communities that we serve. And certainly that's why I wanted to reassure that we might be going for quantity at the moment, but we also want to go for that diversity as well.
Fred, then Anne, and then me.
A simple little point. You did mention that people might come from outside Greater Manchester to work for us, but then they might go back to their other, you know, if they're from Lancashire, they might move to Lancashire again because that's their hometown, for instance. Common sense says that if we're targeting the way that you described, the way we're targeting groups to try and get them to join, we ought to be targeting in Greater Manchester. You know, I don't want to start having a set of rules that says you can only live, but I do want us to target our own people. It's a cracking job. I do remember, just to emphasise your point about when we went to open recruitment, we had 21 bags of mail of applicants. And to be honest, we couldn't cope with even opening them and assessing them. So we did need a much better method, and what you describe feels like a better method. But I do think that for the future, and also for the information, if you're going to send us information, I don't want women ever to be called an underrepresented group when they're half our population. So I still want to know how many women we have, because I know it's very low. And I think that we need to be very positive about that. And the very fact that you're here emphasises that point. But I do think that we'd like to see that statistic. But secondly, we'd like to see a statistic of, I'll call it the ethnic minorities, for want of a better word, so that we can understand how it's changing. Because the one difficulty about the selective way that you're describing, it is also a recipe for making sure that your own crowd keep on getting, you know, and their sons and daughters keep on getting in. So there has to be a delicate balance here to make sure that we just don't go into the old mode was that it was always the sons and daughters of firefighters who got jobs. And, you know, there is a danger when you've got a system like this that starts to be part of the people that get through.
I'm going to jump. I think you've missed the past year. They've addressed that particularly well. And I wouldn't, as chair of this committee, criticise them in that area. I wouldn't support what you'd suggested there. I'll hand over to Dawn now.
Yeah.
Well, so just because we've already got some hard numbers here, haven't we? Whoever joined in January and June, and who we've got on board for September. So perhaps at its simplest, next time you can tell us how those three groups are made up, and then we can see whether it's actually working like you describe.
She's just told us that. She said 50%. No. She told us that 2 minutes ago.
Sorry, is it 50%?
It is about, but I was going to get accurate figures, but it is around the 50% mark, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, no, you just said about 50%. You've not talked about, you've said that now we're up to 5%, did you say?
Yeah.
So that's 5% of the work.
It's 5%, so it's 5% as I've received it, and I'm sorry to butt in because you'll know the figures, but she has just told us that the whole is 5%, and the specific for this cohort that we're looking at here is 50% female. She just told us that.
Sorry, 50% of either female or from ethnic minorities. Yeah.
So what does that mean in the number of women out of, roughly, out of those 27, 37 and 55? So, give me a best guess. Do you think there's 25 women in there?
No, there won't be. Have you?
Just to emphasise the point, in the course that the June course, the 37.
Yeah.
Half of that course of 37 were BME or females. 50% of the whole course were females or BME.
But how many of those are women? About half of those?
It's pretty even split, but we can get you them figures. But 50% of the whole course.
That's all I'm trying to do, to get those figures.
Could I suggest, Chair, that and picking up on those comments and the comments of Councillor Leach earlier on, that we do bring a report back to you that shows you where we started from, what the current rate of performance and recruitment is, perhaps saying something about the work that is going on to try and make sure that we're targeting in a way so it's not same old, and there's a huge amount of work going on, and then also setting out what the trajectory that we're aiming for 2020 looks like, and then hopefully that'll give you some better semblance of how that work's being done.
Don't get me wrong,
all that information.
I'm part guilty for where we are, because I used to be the leader of Great Manchester Fire, so I'm not hiding anything. And for about 7 or 8 years, we didn't do any recruitment at all, so you couldn't do anything then.
So bear with me. I've got Andofield, Linda, and John. Would you give way, Anne, for a moment then?
Sorry, thank you for that. Yeah, it was just, I just wanted to make the point that if this information was in the report, a lot of this discussion wouldn't have been necessary. So in terms of the scrutiny of these reports, the more information that we get, the better, really.
Can I just come in with the point that you made about targeting people? I think the impression may have been given that we were targeting people with relationships with a Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. No, our targeting is done through gyms, through mosques, through community groups, to find the people that we want to attract who wouldn't normally think of a career with the Fire and Rescue Service. It's definitely not through family connections with the service.
You did give that impression.
Anne.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dawn. Obviously, this is my first year of doing this scrutiny as well, so there may be some things that you've covered in the past, and apologies for that if that's the case. Obviously, as important as recruitment is retention and things around average length of service, dropout in year one, reasons for that dropout in year one. I think it'll be quite interesting. If you don't have it today, then obviously information in that future work report would be really interesting. And also, do you attract from other emergency services? Do people sort of move around those services at all between sort of ambulance and paramedics and police? And also, just the last thing, April 2020 isn't that far away. And when do you start formulating your plan for beyond 2020 as well in terms of recruitment and retention? Thank you.
I think you're very right. It's important for us to be able to track people, to make sure that we, having attracted them, we retain them and that we see them progress through the service. So we will add that to this report. Attracting from other emergency services, we certainly attract from the armed forces. And I think actually that's benefit both ways. We get somebody who's used to discipline, but equally it's a career for those people who might be leaving the forces and wondering what their next step is in the services. Though I don't know whether that we sort of blend them and move them all around from police and fire. The April 2020, I think we'll definitely move back to targeted but not quantity. We're always going to have to replace the churn, you know, the 90 or so that leave every year. But we need to be working at increasing the proportion of diversity within the service. So once we have our new operating model, once we know how many firefighters we require, then we will be targeting our approach to make sure that that we don't have to have quite so many in the quantity, and that we can approach it for diversity. Thank you.
I've just got one more.
Just to say, no, it's all right. I was going to say about the fact that your recruitment is fairly insular, and I understand why, to get the numbers through and get the quality through that you want. All I was going to say was, how do you propose to go to the ethnic minorities and other people? And you've actually answered it, because you mentioned about going to gyms, and I was also going to mention the armed forces. Do you actually tap on their door? So you've just preempted everything that I was going to ask. So thank you very much. It's clarified everything that I wanted to know so far. Thank you.
Just on retention, in the wake of Kerslake, it's anecdotally that morale was low, which obviously won't help with retention. Given when you've now got a drive to recruit, and I would imagine that would help the teams generally, has the morale picked up?
I think it's a bit too early to say that and have the evidence. I think anecdotally, any organisation that hasn't recruited for that many years gets stale, and those people haven't the opportunity to pass on their skills and their knowledge and talent to new firefighters. So I think that might well have had an element of reducing the morale within the service. So the very fact that we have this many new recruits coming through is picking up the service and is a buoyant effect to it.
Thank you. I'm done on that. Given the time, I'm going to move straight onto the work programme, which we informally touched upon before the meeting. September on the list here, I think, is pretty much full and chocker. I am going to suggest budget monitoring for October and the school readiness for November/December. Has anybody else got any further contributions? But I don't overly want to dwell on the work programme. John?
Just a very brief question about, is there a time limit for when a report comes to this committee when it's been requested? Because I notice for the September meeting, there are two things, one that will be from February and one that will be from November 2017. Is there a time limit in which this committee actually gets a report?
Pass to Susan.
I think it depends on the nature of the report. Sometimes it's because of delays in work and there's no point taking a report before it's ready to come if there's been legitimate reasons for delay, and other times it's because the committee requests something and then something more pressing comes up in its work programme. So it's a bit of an art. The only other thing that I would say about the work programme, this isn't so much in response to your question, Councillor Leach, is there is a couple of new topics that members have suggested, and I just want to get it on record if that's okay. The women in the criminal justice system and the fairness, equalities and devolution were mentioned as potential topics which we might look to programme. If it would be helpful to members, I will circulate to all members a kind of slightly reconfigured work programme in light of some of the feedback that we've had from members, if that would be helpful, in advance of the next meeting.
Any further comments on work programme? So, Fred.
It still says for September it's 6 o'clock. And obviously, I think we've changed that now to 4:30, and it will be at Bury, I presume.
So, yes, and it will be at Bury. This meeting will be 6 o'clock, but there will be the opportunity for a full tour of the training facilities. I'm saying 4:30, but time exactly to be confirmed, which will be open to certainly members of this committee, and we're probably going to go a bit further. Okay. Any more comments before I close the meeting? Close the meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.